April 15th, 1943. 25,000 feet above occupied Belgium. Captain Werner Schroer of Fighter Wing, 26, couldn't believe his eyes. The American fighters climbing toward his formation looked completely ridiculous. These massive, fat machines seemed to break every rule of fighter plane design that Germany had perfected through 4 years of war. "The Americans are flying barrels," he radioed to his wingman, trying not to laugh out loud. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolts struggling upward looked like cartoon planes compared to the sleek German fighters. With their huge round engines, bubble-shaped cockpits sitting on top of fat bodies, and stubby little wings, they looked more like cargo planes pretending to be fighters. The German pilots had every reason to feel confident. They flew the Focke-Wulf 190, considered the best fighter plane in the world. These Germans were veterans who had fought across Europe, while these Americans were brand new to combat. What could these flying bathtubs possibly do against Germany's best pilots? Within 6 months, those same German pilots would wake up in cold sweats, haunted by nightmares of 8 synchronized machine guns firing together. The flying barrels would become death machines, destroying German fighters with a kind of mechanical efficiency that turned air combat into an industrial slaughter. The P-47 wasn't designed to be pretty. When designer Alexander Kartveli got the order for a high-altitude fighter in 1940, he didn't try to create a graceful dancer in the sky. Instead, he built a flying tank. This 7-ton monster was powered by a 2,000-horsepower Pratt and Whitney engine that could keep running strong at heights where German engines could barely breathe. The numbers seemed to prove the Germans right. The plane weighed 10,000 pounds when empty, heavier than some planes with 2 engines. It couldn't turn quickly. It couldn't climb fast compared to the nimble German fighters. Everything about it seemed wrong for a fighter plane. But hidden inside that ugly frame was something the Germans never expected. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 425 bullets. That's 3,400 rounds total. Enough ammunition for 30 seconds of non-stop firing. When those guns fired together, they sent 100 half-inch bullets per second into a target zone about 6 feet wide. Here's something most people don't know. The Americans actually tested their gun patterns by setting up huge paper targets behind enemy lines. They would fly over at night and shoot at these targets, then send spies to check the bullet patterns. This helped them figure out the perfect distance for all 8 guns to concentrate their fire into one deadly zone. The ideal distance turned out to be 300 yards, where all 8 streams of bullets would meet in a space no bigger than a car door. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who would become one of America's top fighter pilots, discovered what the P-47 could really do during a terrible battle on June 26, 1943. German fighters jumped his Thunderbolt, shooting it full of holes. His plane took over 200 bullet hits. The hydraulic systems were destroyed. His canopy was jammed shut. A German fighter emptied every single bullet it had into Johnson's plane. The P-47 kept flying. The German pilot, whose name was never confirmed, reportedly flew up next to Johnson's destroyed plane, shook his head in disbelief, gave a salute, and flew away. No German fighter could have survived that kind of damage. Word spread quickly through German squadrons. The Americans had built something completely new and terrifying. By fall of 1943, American pilots had figured out the secret to winning with the P-47. Don't try to turn with German fighters. Don't try to outclimb them at low altitude. Instead, climb to 30,000 feet, where the Thunderbolt's special turbo-supercharged engine made it the king of the sky, then dive. In a dive, nothing could catch a P-47. From high altitude, it could reach speeds close to 500 miles per hour, fast enough to catch even the German jet fighters that appeared later in the war. Here's an interesting detail few people know. The P-47's engine was so powerful that pilots actually had to be careful not to overspeed the propeller. If they pushed the throttle too hard too fast, the propeller tips would break the sound barrier and create shock waves that could tear the blades apart. Pilots had to learn a special technique of gradually increasing power to avoid destroying their own engines. Captain Francis Gabreski, who would shoot down 28 enemy planes, described what happened when the P-47's guns hit a target. When you hit them with all 8 guns, they didn't just fall out of the sky. They came apart in pieces. I watched a German fighter literally get cut in half. The pilot never knew what hit him. The math of destruction was simple, but deadly. A 2-second burst fired 200 bullets. At the typical fighting distance of 300 yards, this created a wall of lead that nothing could survive. The special armor-piercing, fire-starting bullets burned at 3,000 degrees, hot enough to melt aluminum instantly. Lieutenant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's greatest fighter pilots with 206 victories, met his end on October 8, 1943. At 28,000 feet, his German fighter's engine struggled in the thin air, while P-47s, perfectly happy at that altitude, dove on his formation. Robert Johnson's combat report was short and simple. Saw hits along the body of the plane, aircraft exploded. No parachute. The mental impact on German pilots was immediate and severe. If Philipp, who had survived 500 combat missions, couldn't beat the Thunderbolts, what chance did regular pilots have? Something most people don't realize is that the P-47 had a special water injection system that gave it emergency power. Pilots called it war emergency power. When activated, it sprayed a mixture of water and methanol directly into the engine, cooling it down and allowing it to produce an extra 800 horsepower for short periods. This turned the already powerful fighter into an absolute monster that could catch anything in the sky. January 1944 brought a new version that fixed the P-47's last weakness. The new paddle blade propeller looked like a massive 4-bladed fan. It increased the climb rate by 40%, allowing Thunderbolts to match German fighters even in climbing contests. The unique thundering roar of these massive propellers became a sound that terrified German pilots. They called it Donnerschlag, which means thunderclap in German. The propeller was so large that ground crews had a saying: "You could hide a jeep behind one blade." This wasn't much of an exaggeration. Each blade was over 6 feet long and more than a foot wide at the base. The entire propeller weighed more than some entire fighter planes from World War I. As P-51 Mustangs took over escort duties for bombers, P-47s switched to ground attack missions, where their heavy guns proved even more deadly. A Thunderbolt could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs, the same as early medium bombers, plus rockets that hit like artillery shells. Against ground targets, those 8 machine guns could destroy a truck convoy in seconds, punch through tank armor, and turn supply columns into burning scrap metal. Here's something rarely mentioned in history books. The P-47 pilots developed a technique called skip bombing, where they would bounce bombs off the ground or water to hit targets hiding under bridges or in tunnels. They practiced this by dropping practice bombs filled with flour on American highways during training, much to the surprise of local drivers who suddenly found themselves covered in white powder. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself was wounded by P-47s attacking his staff car in July 1944. The mental effect on German troops was devastating. Just hearing approaching Thunderbolts sent entire units running for cover. German soldiers developed what doctors called Jabo fever, which was actual physical sickness caused by fear when they heard fighter bombers approaching. The production numbers showed the real difference between America and Germany. Republic Aviation built 15,683 P-47s, more than any other American fighter. At peak production, factories completed one every single hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Meanwhile, Germany struggled to replace losses, sending new pilots into combat with less than 100 hours of training against Americans with over 400 hours. A little-known fact is that many P-47 assembly line workers were women who had never even seen an airplane before Pearl Harbor. They called themselves Rosie the Riveters and could build these complex machines faster than trained German workers could build much simpler planes. One factory team in Indiana set a record by assembling a complete P-47 in just 18 hours. By early 1945, the change in German attitude was complete. Major Joseph Priller, the same pilot who had mocked the P-47 as a pregnant cow in 1943, gave an interview that German leadership decided was too depressing to publish. He said, "The Thunderbolt is the perfect fighter bomber. Those 8 guns never jam, never overheat, and never run out of bullets in normal combat. We laughed at them in 1943. Nobody laughs now. When you hear those guns, you know death has arrived." The final numbers were almost unbelievable. P-47s destroyed 3,752 German aircraft in air combat, 3,315 on the ground, 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railway cars, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. The kill ratio in air combat was more than 4-to-1 in America's favor. One detail that shows the P-47's toughness is that many pilots actually preferred to belly land their damaged planes rather than bail out. The plane's strong construction meant that pilots often walked away from crash landings that would have killed them in any other fighter. There are recorded cases of P-47s landing with entire cylinders shot off their engines, with control cables held together by a single wire, and with holes in the wings big enough to crawl through. The plane also had an unexpected benefit. Its huge size meant it had the roomiest cockpit of any fighter in the war. Tall pilots who couldn't fit in other fighters loved the P-47. One pilot joked that if you got bored during a long mission, you could get up and walk around. This wasn't true, of course, but the cockpit was so big that pilots could actually move around enough to avoid getting stiff during 6-hour missions. At a reunion in Phoenix in 1985, General Adolf Galland, former head of all German fighter planes, thought back about the P-47. "We made a terrible mistake. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. We said Americans don't understand air combat. We were completely wrong. They didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around mass production, firepower, and survival. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I understood everything. The power was unbelievable. But what really impressed me was that America built 15,000 of these complicated machines while fighting wars on 2 sides of the world. Each engine was more complex than anything Germany ever made, yet they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance." Another veteran German pilot added something that rarely gets mentioned. The worst part wasn't even the guns. It was knowing that every P-47 we shot down would be replaced within days, while every pilot we lost was gone forever. They had training bases churning out pilots like factories. We were sending children with glider experience into combat against men who had practiced air combat for hundreds of hours. The P-47 started the war as something German pilots laughed at, and ended it as the most feared plane in German skies. Its 8 guns didn't just defeat the German Air Force, They buried it under a mountain of lead. The change from flying milk bottle to angel of death took less than 2 years. In April 1943, German pilots laughed at the fat American fighter. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the skies belonged to America. Those 8 50 caliber guns had turned mockery into terror, one burst at a time. The last P-47 ever built rolled off the production line in October 1945. By then, the war was over, but the legend was just beginning. Today, only about 10 P-47s still fly, but their thunder still echoes through history as the plane that proved sometimes bigger really is better.